I didn't think to find out where we were until the morning. It's a good enough island, someone said. So be it, smiled Playboy. Let's just say it's good enough for the Marines. We set to work setting up the tents. Lieutenant Big Kino felt it his duty to push us around, and his inane orders were a great hindrance. We had 3 tents, 2 for living and 1 for work. In the 3rd tent, we put all the rudimentary equipment at our disposal for making maps, a table made of a piece of glued plywood, mounted on supports, several compasses, pencils, tracing paper, and 1 or 2 angles. The Marine Corps Reconnaissance Battalion had almost no cartographic equipment. We were regular scouts, that is, the eyes and ears of the battalion commander, and that was all regardless of how much Big Kino sought to exaggerate our tasks. I wanted to be a real scout too, but LT. Big Kino didn't want to hear about it. You are here to publish my newspaper, he insisted. But, Lieutenant, we'll be back on the job soon, and I don't even know what an azimuth is. I'll get lost in a phone booth. I just want to learn how to use a compass and read a map. You don't need that. But, Lieutenant, when the fighting starts, there won't be much time for the paper. What will I do then? Is pitying the enemy a sign of madness or strength? The lieutenant, who had already been my commanding officer for 2 months, waved his hand in disapproval. He had acquired this manner back on Guadalcanal, when one day Sergeant Big Kino was the only one in the entire reconnaissance unit who could explain to the battalion commander what editing aerial photographs was. For this he was promoted to lieutenant. He waved his hand and announced, "When the fighting starts, you will keep the battalion diary." What the hell is that? You'll find out then. Now let's talk about my paper. I'd like to hear what you think about it. So, what do we need to get started? A multiplying machine. Aha. Got it. Talk to the Sergeant Major about it. What else? Paper. Master Sergeant again. What's next? Dialing machine. Same here. What other problems? Reporters. That's understandable. I mean, how many will be needed for the battalion paper? The battalion paper has to print the news, and we'll have to cover all companies. In other words, there's got to be a company reporter in every company. What do you think he's going to report? Everything that happens in the company. The newspaper will have a news report from each reporter, staff news, a poet's corner, a commander's address, and an editorial. The colonel's address, editorial. Yes, sir. And then I'll put it all on the page and decorate it. Perhaps the battalion commander will like the idea of boosting morale. Wait, my boy, take your time. Big Kino stood up and paced nervously back and forth across the room. Then he sat down again and assumed the posture of a Rodenovian thinker. You'll have to be very careful, Lucky. You can't just rush ahead. We have to reckon with the company commanders. They probably won't want an outsider in the company to report on everything that's going on. And if they do, they will demand to be shown the material before it is sent to the newspaper. So we'll have censors, sir. Think what you're saying. We just have to be delicate. Every company commander will want to make sure the reporter hasn't misrepresented anything. We have to be as careful as we can be, you understand? Yes, sir. I think what we're going to do is this. Talk to the Sergeant Major and see what he can do for paper and equipment. In the meantime, I'll probe with the company commanders. We'll have a meeting tomorrow, and we'll figure it out. Oh, and one more thing. Regarding the colonel's address and the editorial. Forget it. Yes, sir. I'm used to taking orders, so I talked to the Sergeant Major, who told me to get the hell out of his tent. LT. Big Kino, after spending the night in reflection, went about his immediate duties the next day. The battalion newspaper was cut from the big picture like a fuzzy aerial photo from an overall montage. Discipline was getting stricter, the command was tightening the screws. One Sunday morning we played volleyball not far from the tent dining room, which had not yet been visited only by the commander and Major Piece of Major, his new and very unpopular Nakstaba. Breakfast time had long since passed, but that of course did not concern Major Piece of Major, who could eat whenever he wanted. The corporal on duty joined the game. Out of the corner of my eye I saw Piece of Major. He came out of the living tent and headed in our direction. A little later, the duty corporal noticed him too, but pretended it didn't concern him. Someone had told him that it was hardly wise to keep the major waiting. But the corporal on duty belonged to that special breed of ugly people who probably try to compensate for their inferiority by inexplicably strong feelings. And he continued to play volleyball as if nothing had happened. We were getting nervous. The major waited. The general tension exploded with a thunderous yell from the major. Master Sergeant. He bellowed, glaring angrily at the corporal on duty, who was frozen in place. Master Sergeant. Sergeant at arms. The sergeant in charge flew out of the tent and froze, trying to take in the situation with a single glance. Piece of Major bent his legs a little, like a monstrous frog preparing to leap, and bellowed. Arrest this man. And the unfortunate corporal was led away. We were soon to leave the island. There were rumours that it was because of the many cases of typhus among the men. But as it later turned out, we were just at the assembly point to join up with other military formations and launch another offensive against the Japanese. The war was close at hand. We eagerly awaited news of victories in the Pacific, of Allied successes in North Africa, as all this brought the already turning tide closer to the shores of an enemy exhausted by protracted fighting. In the week before our departure, our small unit had increased by one ally. But what an ally! "There is an Australian on the road," said Lieutenant Big Kino. "Go and give him the help he needs." I went to the road and there met Digger. He was in a jeep so heavily laden that it made me think of a recluse with a hoarding mania, or of overloaded trucks taking people and their possessions out of the earthquake zone. There were at least 3 camping woks, the rather shabby vessels in which tea-loving Australians boil their beverage, a flute, a rusty British helmet and its shiny new American sister, a kerosene lamp, a gasoline lantern, a packed stove, cans of tea and sugar, sacks of rice, 3 or 4 swollen sacks of miscellaneous items of American and British military uniform, a grass skirt, and a pipe bought, as Digger later explained to me, from a Yankee for 14 shillings. In addition, the jeep contained the driver, Digger himself, and 4 embarrassed dark-skinned Melanesians, with bulky bales hanging from their mighty shoulders. In general, the picture before my eyes delighted me, and not only me. A crowd was gradually gathering around. The Marines were waiting to see how things would unfold. "Hey, you," Digger shouted irritably. "Do you always just stare when you should be helping?" I started to help him unload. When the contents of the jeep were on the ground, forming a medium-sized mountain, the driver hurried away, showering us with a choking cloud of dust. Digger was annoyed to the extreme. Everyone could see it now, for he pushed his tattered wide-brimmed hat to the back of his head and revealed to the world his small tanned face, covered with tanned skin and adorned with small black moustaches. The natives sensed his mood. They stood shuffling gingerly from foot to foot, evidently not knowing what to expect from the future. I thought he was enjoying their embarrassment, for a thoughtful, dreamy expression suddenly appeared on his face, and he began to look over their heads and admire the waterfall on Mount Nichilolo. Perhaps, though, Digger was trying to hide his own embarrassment, hoping that his pensive look would impress us. Finally, he turned to me and said, "Show us out, Yankee. There's a 2nd battalion around here somewhere. We've got to get there." I took him to a tent hastily pitched directly behind ours. While I was helping him pull up the ropes, the tent was askew and sagging. Not unlike an officer putting it up, there was unintelligible speech and a suspicious noise from the bushes. There was chopping of branches. It was Digger's natives at work. They had followed us all the way, but so silently that I had forgotten all about them. The inarticulate muttering turned out to be the dialect of their tribe. They all came from New Guinea, or, to be exact, from the Leh district, where Digger had been a planter before the Japanese invasion. And the branches were meant to build a dwelling for them. The natives couldn't sleep in the same tent as the planter. And certainly he couldn't let them eat our food. The bags of rice were brought in so they could cook their meals. I helped Digger get what he needed from the quartermaster and promised to return after supper to show him the river in which we were bathing. On returning, I was stopped 10 paces from his tent by the sharp sound of a trumpet, which disturbed the tranquility of the island. At the first moment it seemed as shrill and even as vulgar as the whistle of a steam locomotive. Listening, I recognized the tune with some difficulty. It was, "It's going to be hot in the old town tonight." I poked my head inside the tent. In the dim light of a kerosene lamp placed on the ground, I saw him slouching on his bunk and trumpeting with all his might, his face flushed red from the effort. Noticing me, he looked away from his occupation for a moment, wiped his mouth with his hand, and said, "Ah, hello, Yankee," sit down, after which he trumpeted again. At the same time he gradually raised his foot, and quite high, and lowered it in the most difficult parts of the melody. Apparently, the process of lowering his foot helped him to cope with the intricate melody. It was undoubtedly the familiar song "It's Going to Be Hot in the Old Town Today." Now the melody was quite recognizable, though he didn't feel like singing along. "Where did you learn that?" I asked him when he'd finished. "The Yankee I bought this thing from taught me," he replied, bending down to light the stove on which he was boiling water for tea. It was already too dark to go to the river. "And you know it's an American song?" "Of course it is. Some things you Yankees can do. I really like that tune, although of course it's American. But I like American music. Listen, aren't you from Texas?" "No," I answered. "I'm from New Jersey." Ah, he said, and went about making tea. "Will you be with us long?" "I don't know," Digger shrugged. What do you mean?" "What do you mean?" "A secret," he winked. "A big secret." "What do you mean?" "What do you mean?" Just what he said. "A secret. I can't tell you anything. Someone in Australia told me to get off and join the Marines. And here I am. Would you like some tea, Yank?" "And your natives?" I asked, not refusing a cup of tea. "They're with me. That's all you need to know. Anyway, we'll go on together. I don't know whether it's for better or worse, but I hope it's for the better. I got to tell you, Yanks, I'd feel a lot better on my own. You've got no business being around Australian soldiers." "The hell I don't. We're superior to the Australians in every way. Ask the Japs what they think of the enemy. They think American Marines are the toughest in the world. After us it's the US, Marines, and then the Australians." "Who told you that nonsense?" He snorted. When the rumble of cannonade and the roar of dive planes subsided, our new battalion commander set up a command post about 50 meters from the water's edge. The attacking companies moved forward to take position along a crescent-shaped defensive line that rested its sharp edges against the shore. Its maximum width was 9.5 kilometers. Our unit was not to move any further. We were to remain in this very spot alone, riding the road along the shore, while the others would storm Cape Gloucester to the northwest. We formed a sort of defensive clip between our division and the enemy, who was thought to be south of us. The next reinforcements to the Japanese would surely have to pass us. So we found ourselves all alone, with no communication with the main force, since, as the commander explained, for natural reasons radio communication does not work here. From here the commander sent out daily reconnaissance patrols. With the tireless precision characteristic of the man, he continued to send men out to scout unknown territory, starting from the moment of disembarkation. They went and returned back and forth, south, west, north, and east, gradually going farther and farther, reaching like tentacles through the senses of our battalion. a military organism lying in the jungle trying to find the enemy. During one of our expeditions to the northward, our patrol came across the body of a scout from Company E who had been reported missing. Apparently, he had been in a hand-to-hand fight before he died. 12 bayonet wounds were found on his body. Apparently, his opponents practiced stabbing him, and in his mouth they had stuffed a piece of flesh cut from his arm. The dead man's comrades said that he had a tattoo there, the emblem of the Marine Corps, an anchor, and a globe. The Japanese cut it off and stuffed it in the poor man's mouth. The commander was angry. And again an incident in the northern direction. Their 2 Japanese officers were caught and killed sniffing something near our positions. A Company E patrol, surveying the area in front of their positions, came across Japanese, about a platoon in number, who were sleeping right on the ground. Sleeping. They were shot and moved back without waiting for another platoon to approach. The enemy was here very near. But what were his forces? If the Japanese we saw were on patrol, their forces were commensurate with ours. But the enemy's behavior was also puzzling. They could afford to sleep without even posting sentries. Were they not aware of our presence? Obviously, these were the questions on the commander's mind as he sent a new patrol southward. It was still quiet to the south, and no one wanted to see this situation change too suddenly, putting us between 2 fires. Lieutenant Commando led the patrol, and I joined it as a scouting private. Commando, who had joined us in Australia, was a big, strong Frenchman who spoke with a slight accent. His language could well have been mistaken for the English of a French Canadian. But Commando was a native of France. He had earned his nickname from his participation in the Dieppe raid. He had seen enough of the British paratroopers' techniques and was eager to adopt them here. But he did not take into account our pride in being US Marines and did not understand the obvious differences in terrain between Europe and Oceania, so he was often disappointed when his comments were ignored. Our route followed a narrow path that first stretched along the shore, and then turned away from the ocean and into the interior of the island, climbed a hill, and then was lost in the jungle. It twisted and twisted as if it had been blazed by a drunken native. There were 10 of us. We moved one after another. Usually one of the scouts went first, but now a Marine from Company G was at the head of our little column, and we were sneaking along behind. The line of formation, of course, was not too neat, but nevertheless clear enough. We kept a strict distance, about 6 meters, and at the sign of the leader, usually a raised hand, we hid in the jungle. We did not smoke and walked in silence. All items of equipment that might clatter or rattle were securely fastened. Weapons hung across our chests, the quickest way to engage them to fire, or to rest the butt on the ground to prevent a fall. My Tommy was loaded, but the safety was on. With one swipe of my right index finger, I could take it off the safety and pull the trigger. Even those with only rifles were prepared to shoot from the hip, as encounters in the jungle are only unexpected, for the dense rainforest limits visibility to 5 meters. What was the point of aiming at that distance, even if there was time to do so? The patrol moved slowly through the jungle. For fear of ambush, we walked very slowly, at the speed of a crawling man. I'm not exaggerating. Every time a foot had to be firmly planted on the ground before lifting the other, and special care had to be taken to avoid the traps that the Japanese set in abundance. Our movements resembled the movement of crabs on land. Left foot, bend, look, listen. Pause, right foot, bend, look, listen, pause, and so on. At that speed, it would take a whole day to walk 1.5 kilometers and come back. If the route goes over hills or the path curves too often, then even more. On this patrol, it took us 20 minutes to make one bend, because the bend was just at the beginning of a rise, and this terrain is ideal for an ambush. The enemy has the added advantage of surprise. He has the opportunity to pour fire into your ranks when you can't see anything yet. He can even let you pass him and fire from the rear. Nothing is as demoralizing as this technique. We safely passed the turn, and then some small hills, covered with a layer of mud and therefore very slippery, and reached the high ground. We were on what might be called a cliff or steep precipice, from which the descent to the sea began on our right. If you listened closely, you could hear the sound of the surf. The silence all around was such that it was alarming. Even the birds were silent. No movement was felt in the jungle. This calmness could have been due to our approach or spoke of the presence of an enemy somewhere nearby. It was raining heavily. The infantryman leading the formation was clearly visible to everyone. We were approaching another turn. Crouching low, he looked around, then dropped to his belly and crawled forward to peer around the corner. A hand went up. We disappeared into the bushes that approached the trail. The hand went up again, showing 4 fingers. There were 4 enemies. I lay in the tall grass and wondered how far my heartbeat could be heard and whether it could give me away. Then it occurred to me that I could see nothing through the grass. If a Japanese walked by, I could only see his feet, but I could shoot him. Then I remembered that the guy ahead of me was hiding on the other side of the path, so I had to be careful not to accidentally hit him. I saw that the guy walking behind me had also darted into the bushes on the opposite side of the trail, and I hoped he would be careful. Afterward, I thought that perhaps we might not have to shoot at all. There were enough of us to handle the Japanese without using guns. Maybe we should suggest to the lieutenant that we take them prisoner. But the commando had other plans. When I looked back, I saw that he had called one of the boys to him and whispered something to him. The latter, having listened to the order, crawled to the corner where our leader was. In another minute, the leader crawled up to the commando, and they conferred about something for several minutes. Then I saw an unfamiliar infantryman who had prepared a grenade launcher. The commando approached him. About 100 meters to the left, he whispered. The infantryman nodded. The leader returned to his seat. He raised his hand. The grenade launcher fired. Then another and another. In all, he fired 5 grenades. I heard 5 explosions. The lead man came back. The commando looked at him demandingly. The anchorman shrugged his shoulders. His shoulders were more expressive than the whispered explanation. The hell of it. Maybe. They were coming down the hill. 4 of them. I think we got the first guy. They're all laying low now. The joy that had lit up Commando's face quickly faded. He relaxed for a moment, then a look of irritation came over his face. I tried to catch his eye, but he ignored me. He'd been ignoring me from the start, and I reminded myself to correct the lies he was sure to report back to headquarters when he returned. I don't know, Lieutenant, the anchorman repeated again and froze in anticipation. The commando's face brightened again. 4, huh? He asked, emphasizing the last word. Excellent. He leaned over and patted the grenade launcher on the shoulder. Good job, he said. And then he gave me a piercing look right in the eye. I realized that he knew I was here and who I was. I would be expected to confirm the deception. Suddenly I felt cold. The rain had penetrated my clothes and chilled my body unpleasantly. My frozen neck whimpered and my head turned with difficulty. At this moment, the guy who took the anchor's seat raised his hand. The host hurried back. Then he came back, conferred with the commando, and took his seat again. My teeth clacked as the lead man opened fire, and the grenadier started firing grenades again. When the lead man ran past me, ducking and spreading his legs wide like a jockey, and the guy second in line also hastily retreated, I realized what was happening. LT. Kommando was playing commando. It was a street fighting technique. One man shoots and retreats, covered by the second man, who is now firing. Then he too retreats, covered by a third, and so on down the line. This can go on indefinitely, or at least until the unit moves into position or runs out of ammunition. There is no doubt the tactic is excellent for cities, but its application in the jungle is as limited as that of skiers in the Sahara, and our method of crawling through the jungle is inapplicable. Such tactics are suitable if there is little or no cover. But there is more than enough cover in the rainforests of New Britain. My disdain for LT. Commando's inappropriate tactics only increased when the last infantryman in front of me shot and ran past me. "Fucking asshole," he hissed. "Scum. Son of a bitch." He looked at me and added, "Commando's got all his brains up his ass. He's sitting on them." Seeing that it was none other than the valiant Souvenir, I felt that my own opinion of the lieutenant had been upheld by no less than the Supreme Court. A moment more and Souvenir was behind me. Now it was my turn to shoot. I took a knee and fired from the hip, gripping the gun belt tightly with my left hand so that the muzzle would not scuff upward. I quickly emptied a magazine, a rather large one, 30 rounds in the direction of the enemy, and turned to flee, feeling a burning hatred for the insane crackling that had shattered the silence of the jungle and made my position so vulnerable. The farce continued until we reached the next bend. There we took a breath, looked around, and headed home, moving much faster this time because we no longer feared an ambush. The rain had stopped, but the rainforest continued to drip and drip. As we approached the ridge, we rounded another bend, and I saw a giant spider climbing its web over the head of the guy ahead of us. It was one of those nightmarish black and red creatures with furry paws growing straight out of a torso the size of a grown man's fist. In a split second, the monster snapped off the web and slammed right onto my comrade's helmet. He tore the helmet off his head in horror and tossed it far aside. I waited until he found the helmet in the bushes, covering him just in case, and then we caught up with the others. Lieutenant Commando and I proceeded together to the command post. At this time, another patrol was coming out of the headquarters tent. Judging by the fact that the guys had automatic rifles hanging on their chests, they were going to have a fight. The commander was in the tent. He was talking to a young officer from Company F. Seeing us, he visibly relaxed, and when he saw Commando, showed him 4 fingers, even smiled. Even in the semi-darkness of the place, you could see how triumphant Commando's eyes gleamed. "That's all right," he finished his conversation with the young officer and immediately turned to us. "It's good to see you, Lieutenant." We heard gunfire. "What was it?" "We came across an enemy firing point in the Tuwali area," so the Commando replied. He pulled a map out of his pocket, unfolded it, and showed the spot where we fired at the white light. "There were 4 of them, sir. We destroyed them with small arms fire and grenade launchers." "Did you find anything interesting on the bodies?" the commander asked hopefully. "No, sir," the Commando replied without hesitation. "We didn't have time to search them. We had the impression that it was a small part of the main force." I looked at Commando in surprise from the corner of the tent I had thoughtfully retreated to. I looked at him and could not believe my eyes. He was the very embodiment of confidence. The commander shrugged. "That's too bad. We have almost no information." "Well," he said and laughed, "if we don't, we'll get it. After all, our primary mission is to kill the little yellow-faced bastards, and you've done a fine job of it. If I'm right in my predictions, something's coming, and soon." "All right," he smiled again, showing smooth white teeth. "You can go now, Lieutenant. Good job." The Commando thanked the commander and left. Watching him, I suddenly realized he's not a liar at all. He really believes what he's saying. In addition, he is not a coward at all. I saw how he behaved in a moment of danger. Souvenir is right. After all, the Commando is sitting on his brains. Fortunately, Commando's report had no effect on the commander's actions. We were still on 24-hour alert, waiting for a possible Japanese attack. But that night they never showed up. In the morning I went out again on a patrol ordered to survey the road to Tuwali. This time it was led by Lieutenant Miyata. On this patrol I took the leading position, which belonged to me by right, but that must have been only because I was the only one who had been in the area before. LT. Mint was a man sensible enough to take advantage of that. Mint was a very capable, very calm and very sensible officer. He had been promoted to officer from the ranks, like many of our commanders, but he was not proud or uppity. An obvious sign of aplomb in the face of such apparent good fortune, we considered it an unquestionable favour from the gods, was that Mint continued to chew gum. The Clean Linen League, as we called the officer corps, could not make him change his manners, and even now, as he explained his task to us, his jaws made slow, measured movements. "Don't forget, Lucky, to show me the place where you came upon the enemy yesterday." It was raining, and the road was more slippery than usual, so we moved forward even more slowly than the day before. There was the occasional sound of the ocean on our right, but everything else was drowned out by the rain. I was told by the chain of command that the lieutenant wanted a word, so I headed toward him. He was squatting on the side of the road with a map in his lap. With one hand he held his raincoat over his head to keep the map from getting wet. He waved at me, and I squatted down beside him. "Where are we?" he asked quietly. The simple question shocked me. I had been so focused on getting through the many twists and turns safely that I had lost track of my direction. I was worried about the enemy, not the direction of travel. I held my breath and listened to the sound of the ocean. If I could hear it to my right, then we were heading in the right direction. If I couldn't hear it at all, or if I could hear it to my left, then we were lost. I heard it. The ocean was exactly where it was supposed to be, to our right. I looked at the scale of the map, did some calculations in my mind, and pointed confidently to the point on the map. Mint nodded, and I scrutinized his face. It was the focused face of an intelligent, thinking man. I saw his expression of concern leave him, his jaw move rhythmically again, and I realized that everything was all right. So I silently obeyed when he gestured for me to return to my seat. The rain had stopped. As we walked to the plateau where the fiasco under Lieutenant Commando had taken place, the washed jungle glistened with green foliage. We came to an open area, a small clearing covered with low grass below a hole in the jungle roof. Beyond it began a low hill, the opposite slope of which was just around the proverbial bend. On the slope of this hill we noticed a distinct footprint. The foot was definitely barefoot, broad, and had strong, tenacious toes. It was the foot of a native who was walking towards us. Noticing the footprint, I became alarmed and immediately reported the find to Mint. I wanted to discuss with him a plan of further action, but he nervously waved away and said, "Let's go quickly. We must climb the hill. This is a bad place." We went forward, but we moved very slowly. It was too slippery. Thinking about the strange trail, I had almost forgotten to tell Mint where our encounter with the enemy had taken place. When I remembered, I hastened to correct the mistake. "Lieutenant, this is where we ran into them yesterday." Mint looked very focused. "What about the trail?" "Nuts." He looked at me thoughtfully, shifting his helmet to the back of his head. His jaws moved rhythmically and non-stop, as if he were drawing his strength from the piece of rubber band in his mouth. What he repeated, more to himself than to me. "Well, it's there, so what? What can we do about it?" He shrugged and stared at me thoughtfully. "We'd better stop here for a while. You'll guard the approaches from the rear." "But, Lieutenant," I protested, trying to hide my resentment. "I should be in front." "Do it," he replied calmly. "Do as I say. Approaches from the rear." I obeyed, feeling demoted. Taking a few steps down the crest of the hill, I took cover in the bushes. Breaking a few branches of plants unknown to me that were blocking the view, I settled down with every comfort. From my place I could see the whole slope, so I had no fear of overlooking anything, but I still felt resentful that I had been undeservedly sent to the rear. The rain had stopped, and it was very quiet. Not even the sound of the ocean was coming this way. A branch snapped. I looked up and saw 4 men. They were coming toward me. They were sticking together. At first I thought they were ours, and I wondered why Major Peace had sent another patrol here, and why he was so happy to lead it himself. The man in front, a rather large man, looked a lot like the Major. They came closer. I saw helmets resembling mushroom caps and realized that they were Japanese. I lay down and said to myself, wait, let them get closer, and then you can take them off in one shot. They were coming down the slope. The large man leading this small group walked with his head bowed and arms waving. The moment I pressed the trigger, he looked even more like Piece of Major to me. One face. They fell down. The first to fall was the big man. He grabbed his rifle, shrieked shrilly, turned and fell. The others fell too and screamed too, with one rolling down the hillside. He rolled for a long time until he was out of sight forever. I emptied the big magazine, which had a capacity of 30 rounds. I still had one left for 20 rounds. I had no idea if there were any more Japanese in the vicinity or how many, so I left my position and ran back. The first of our guys I saw stared at me, eyes wide and mouth open. Stay here, I commanded, keeping up my speed, and hurried over to LT. Mint. He didn't look worried, though, of course, the shelling in the rear couldn't leave him indifferent. What is it? He asked. Yeah, Japanese patrol, I exhaled. There were 4 of them. I think I got them all, but maybe there are others. I didn't have to wait. Lieutenant Mint was on his feet in a second, gesturing for another infantryman to follow us, and for the rest of us to stay put and stay alert. Let's go, he said. So we returned to the crest of the hill. Did you see anyone? I asked the guy who had stayed behind me. He shook his head. At that moment I heard moaning. You want me to see what's out there? I asked the lieutenant. He nodded. I dropped to my stomach and slowly crawled up the slope. The big man was lying in the same place where he had fallen. He was dead. A little farther away, 2 others lay. As I approached, one of them began to crawl away. There was a deafening rumble. The infantryman who had stayed with LT. Mint had reached for his Tommy. The sound was so loud it made my ears pop. Deciding that a new enemy force was approaching, I hurried back. He almost got you, exclaimed the guy who was holding a machine gun. Who got me? The Japanese I fed lead to. He was aiming at you. The boy was absolutely delighted. When he spoke, his bushy moustache moved. I glanced at the lieutenant. He was clearly concerned. The safety of the men entrusted to him in a situation like this couldn't help but be alarming. I thought, this guy's not all at home. The only living Japanese here is the wounded man, but nevertheless, I thanked him for saving my precious person. From the slope came a groan. And then the sound of some movement. With a combined effort, we finished off the wounded man. I fired in short bursts so as not to run out of ammunition. Listen, Lieutenant Matter said to us. You 2 stay here. I think we should break for the ocean. There's no point in going back the way we came. The Japanese may be after us. As soon as you see the last of ours, follow them. There was silence. It seemed to me that there was some movement at the bottom of the hill, but it was soon silent. But our patrol, moving through the bush towards the sea, was making more noise than it should. Evidently the men were so anxious to be away from the accursed plateau that they didn't bother to keep quiet. They stomped and crushed everything in their path like a herd of mastodons. When we saw the trailing one, we followed him, but at the last my comrade poured a long machine gun burst down the slope. As we passed a thicket of bushes, we realized the cause of the noise. The descent to the sea was lined with smooth, slippery stones. All the way to the water's edge, and it was still several hundred meters, we slid, moved and rolled down the slope, every second expecting an enemy attack. It was not a very successful flanking movement, but it got us out of the encirclement in which we found ourselves, or thought we were. We walked for a long time along the pebble-strewn shore, crossed over flooded areas, climbed dark cliffs jutting out into the grey sea, and when Mint thought we had lost enough of our way, we returned to the trail. Having given all the necessary orders, Mata came to me. You should go back to the frontier and tell me everything that happened there. I turned to go to follow the order, but the lieutenant suddenly put a hand on my shoulder. Yes, I forgot to tell you. He smiled and waved his hand in the direction we'd come from. Good job. He's not a bad guy after all. It wasn't far to our position, and I trudged through the jungle, eager to break the great news as soon as possible and enjoy the admiration of my comrades. Suddenly a sentry from one of our forward posts blocked my way. I grinned contentedly and gave him 4 fingers. Brilliant, admired the sentry. Who took them down, Lucky? I reported as I ran past, and was extremely flattered to hear a shocked "fuck you" behind me. By the time I got to my position, my conscience had kicked in. I remembered the need to always tell the truth and only the truth, and began to show only 3 fingers to those I met. At the command post, I also told the truth. The commander immediately sent another patrol group, ordering it to find Lieutenant Mata's men and jointly survey the area to the south. The need for this was quite obvious. They found nothing. There were only the bodies of 3 Japanese soldiers and signs that the 4th, a wounded Japanese, had escaped. There might even have been 5, but the 5th had also escaped. Even the footprint of the natives' bare feet had been washed away by the rain. We could never explain how the enemy patrol had gotten behind us, and the dark haze of the rainforest shrouded the incident in mystery. That night there was a skirmish with the Japanese. They sprang out of the pitch blackness of the jungle, materialized out of the night darkness. Their attack seemed even more fierce than it really was, because it was accompanied by the deafening howl of the wind, which had gained the strength of a hurricane. I personally did not take part in the skirmish. In fact, only 20 or 30 Marines took part. The Japanese appeared at the site of Company G, which occupied the center elevation of the perimeter. This elevation surrounded the command post on all sides except the west side, so that our headquarters was in the center of the horseshoe rising above it. The attack began at 2:00 in the morning, when a fierce wind arose, rapidly gaining the strength of a hurricane. The darkness was filled with its piercing howl, the crack of breaking branches, the rumble of falling trees. The ocean was also raging, roaring and moaning as if in pain, and it rained incessantly. On such a night one can judge everything happening around us only by the sounds coming from outside. No bullets were flying around us, so we could conclude that we were not yet defeated. But we knew nothing more. I sat in the staff tent on full alert, awaiting instructions from either the commander or Major Piece of Major. I had a thermal grenade with me, which I was to use to destroy all our papers if the Japanese managed to break through. The other scouts also found something to do. They were bringing up ammunition, while I stayed in the tent the whole time, only occasionally looking out into the darkness with curiosity. I could hear them grumbling as they ran past the headquarters tent with heavy boxes on their shoulders. Sometimes I even managed to see them in the momentary flash of light caused by a shell explosion or lightning. Some of them even sobbed with bitter, impotent anger, once again sliding down the slippery slope and suffering heavy blows from their heavy loads. Then they had to blindly search for the boxes that had fallen aside, crawling in the darkness and mud, and only then make another attempt to climb up. But our stovepipes needed ammunition. As far as I could tell from the sounds, they were widening their firing sector and making the hail of mines falling on it more dense. When they opened fire, the infernal rumble drowned out even the noise of the weather. The machine gun fire stopped. Not even individual bursts could be heard. Occasionally rifle shots were heard, but nothing indicated that the enemy was approaching. Apparently, the battle was gradually dying. Mortars were bellowing all over the place. We had won. At the first glimmer of dawn, we learned what had happened. One Japanese officer and 4 soldiers had been captured and taken to the command post. From them we learned that the 3rd Company, 53rd Regiment, 17th Japanese Division had been detached from the main force at Cape Gloucester and sent to Tahuali to oppose our landing. Their route was through impenetrable jungle, so they were delayed and did not arrive until 2 days after our landing had ended. Nevertheless, they attacked. With about 100 soldiers at their disposal, they attacked us 1,200 Marines and were completely wiped out except for a few prisoners. Who were they, brave or fanatics? What were they hoping for? Did the Japanese commander really believe that a company of Japanese soldiers could overpower a battalion of American Marines, experienced, well-trained, confident, better armed, and in a much better position? Why didn't he take his men home? Was it because no Japanese soldier can be defeated, thereby losing face? None of these questions can be answered by me. I can only wonder at this mysterious, so brutal, and yet so brave an opponent. The wanton fanaticism of the Japanese reached such a degree that it involuntarily aroused respect and made us muster all our strength to defend ourselves. We lost 6 men killed, among whom was the brave and somewhat reckless Obi, whom I had last seen in Melbourne so drunk that he could not stand on his feet. His firing point was captured in the first surprise attack by the Japanese. Obi took part in the counterattack and helped dislodge the enemy, sending bullets and curses at him alternately, pushing until he was shot in the forehead. May he rest in peace. The corpses of the Japanese lay in piles on the hillside and in the trench where Obi's machine gun had been set up. Souvenir hunters scurried between them, tearing off insignia from their shirts, removing rings from their fingers, and pulling out pistols. Souvenir was also here. He methodically went from body to body, armed with forceps and a special flashlight used in dental practice, which he had thoughtfully bought in Australia. I stood silently among the dead bodies. They lay mangled, useless, like broken dolls. Their life force had left them. A bullet or a shell fragment had made a hole in the fragile vessel, and its contents had leaked out. In these shapeless lumps of flesh once lived the mystery of the universe, which gave each one a unique individuality, expressed in different ways. One had a special gait, another a way of speaking, another the ability to express his thoughts on paper or put strokes on canvas. They were so different, and suddenly they were nothing, clumps of nothing. How could a bullet or a tiny fragment do such crushing, irreparable damage? Did that great, mysterious power that lived in everyone, I mean the soul, flow out to the earth with the blood? No, it can't be. It's out there somewhere, I know it. After all, this yellow-red piece of flesh I am looking at now was a human being not so long ago. And that which breathed life energy into it, the word which gave the etheric void, life and name, the word from the supreme word, all this cannot be destroyed by a piece of hot metal. The mystery of the universe had left him. Needless to say, the riddle was solved, and the mystery was gone. It had changed location. What made those nostrils flare, gave strength to the hand from which the blood was now flowing so heavily, continued to exist, and still had the power to make his nostrils flare and his fists clench as before. Even if it's gone, no one can say it won't come back. Even if you say it has never returned, you cannot say with certainty that it will continue to do so. It is blasphemy to claim that a shard of heated metal can cut off life, just as it would be overconfident to claim that because life is gone, it is destroyed. Standing among the piles of dead bodies, I realized, no, I felt, that death is a sound we make to express what we do not yet know. I walked down the hill. On the way, I stopped to chat with Digger. He and his natives were ensconced on the high ground behind the positions of Company E. He was glad to see me. He made tea and said he was shocked at what had happened. "Where the hell did you Yankees learn to shoot like that?" he asked. "What a cannonade you had last night. I must admit you made me a little nervous." He took a few big gulps of his tea, and looked at me. Marines are pretty damn good. Almost as good as us. It was an initiation into knighthood. By morning, the storm had abated. It sank 2 amphibious tanks and one of the landing craft, but no one dared to go out on the small black beach because there was a new danger. At dawn, a well-camouflaged enemy gun began trying to get us from the hills. There was no way to establish its location. All the shells so far had fallen into the water near the shore. Now I led patrols every day. I still didn't know what an azimuth was, and I could read a map with great difficulty. And yet I continued to lead patrols, using the noise of my good old friend, the ocean, as a guide. We surveyed the territory mainly north of our positions in the direction of the so-called Dorf Point. There the wrecks of barges lined the beaches, which the enemy had used to bring in supplies until nightly transports were terminated by our torpedo boats based on New Guinea. On one such patrol under the command of a lanky and very good-natured Lieutenant Svoyak of Company E, we came upon a group of native huts. Inside it was empty and smelled of fish, a smell we associated with the Japanese. I touched the bed on which we had evidently recently lain, and it was still warm. There was cause for concern. "It's still warm," I said to Lieutenant Svoyak. They had just left. He nodded and ordered us to give chase. But it was getting late, and we couldn't get any farther from our positions without risking being caught in the jungle at night. So we turned south. I stepped back to the lieutenant, and my place at the head of the column was taken by another fellow. And almost immediately he raised his hand. We scattered. But before we could clear the road, a young and strong native materialized from the roadside bushes. He saluted us, British style, and stood smirking, as if pleased at our clumsy attempts to avoid detection. My brother-in-law and I stared at him in mute amazement. The lieutenant gestured to him to approach, but the native remained where he was. It seemed to me that he had reason not to move. He seemed to be guarding someone or something. "Let me approach him, Lieutenant," I suggested. "Maybe he speaks pidgin?" "Give it a try," he agreed. His reluctance to move from his seat became clear as I got closer. Behind him was the most pathetic, most distressed, most careless, and most smiling procession I had ever seen. There were 50 of them. Some waddled on makeshift crutches, others, the oldest, travelled on stretchers, still others walked, supported by the sturdier members of this strange group. Prolonged starvation had turned them all, old and small, into skinned skeletons, their ribs protruding so much that they threatened to pierce their skin if they moved. Their bodies were covered with sores that must have caused great pain, and yet the dark, haggard faces were all smiling. I had never seen such bright, joyful smiles before. Their leader smiled too, and in that moment, filled with trust and beauty, I wanted to hug him. "Do you speak pidgin?" "Oh yes, massa. I'm a fighter from the mission." I waved hello to the people listening to our conversation. "Where are these people from?" "Vairamo. They live in Vairamo." And he pointed toward a village about 2 kilometers to the north. "They're all good people, and they don't like the Japanese." "Are you telling me the truth?" "Oh yes, massa, the whole truth. I'm from the mission." He looked at me very solemnly. "Father Moraes always told us that we must tell the truth, always and to everyone." I thought he had something to tell me, so I nodded encouragingly. 2 Christmases ago, the Japanese came. Kanaka doesn't like the Japanese. The Japanese were killing. Kanaka was hiding in the bush. The native waved his hand toward the mountains at the back of the island. The Japanese came. They caught Mayor's father. They cut off his head. Kanaka was hiding. You came. The Japanese ran away. Kanaka left the bush. The village of Wermo belongs to him. Is that clear? I nodded and motioned for him to follow me to the lieutenant's office. In a nutshell, I explained to LT, Svoyak, what had happened. The natives wanted to return to their village. Could we allow them to do so? The lieutenant shrugged his shoulders. Perhaps we should take them with us. But we don't have enough food, we barely have enough for ourselves. The brother-in-law took off his helmet and scratched the back of his head. Then let them go to the village, he said. And we'll keep this fellow as a hostage. He can talk to Digger. After all, it's his direct duty to reorganize the natives. So that's what Digger's mission is, I thought, and said aloud. What about the Japanese we're chasing? They can take these people out without too much trouble. I turned to the native and asked him about the Japanese. He smiled. The Japanese are fleeing, he said proudly. I glanced at the lieutenant. He, too, was smiling. Listen, I said to the native. Yankee number 1, I pointed to the lieutenant, says the Kanako will go home to Veremo, and you're coming with us, okay? Yes, massa, he smiled again. The native, his name was Kolo, went back to his men. As they went by, our lads began to offer them cigarettes, sweets, rations, whatever they had in their pockets. The natives accepted the gifts with gratitude and dignity. I noticed that there were children among them, their little bellies bloated with hunger. One of the elders on a stretcher sucked on a bamboo shoot and waved to them as a greeting. They disappeared around the corner, and Kolo stayed by my side. At the lieutenant's silent command, the patrol group resumed moving. We came to a stream that crossed the trail where it turned toward the sea. It was 3 meters wide and less than half a meter deep. I rolled up my pants, preparing to ford this unexpected water obstacle, when someone's strong arms picked me up, and a moment later I was, completely dry, on the opposite bank. I turned around indignantly and met my gaze with a smiling Colorado. When we got back to the frontier, Colorado was taken to Digger. The next day Digger, accompanied by his boys and a well-armed group of Marines, travelled to Veremo. It became clear for what purpose he had been assigned to the Marines. The British or their fellow Australians had no intention of leaving this source of cheap labour unattended and subjecting it to the ravages of American generosity. But Colorado stayed with us, or rather with me. He became my orderly. He slept on the ground under my hammock and even washed my clothes. 2 days after our chance encounter in the jungle, I was sitting on the beach while a native washed my uniform. It was one of the sunny days that have become a rarity. The jungle was actively evaporating moisture, and the wet clothes were also visibly steaming. On days like this, we washed our clothes in the ocean, first dunking them in water, then rubbing them on the abrasive sand for a long time, then rinsing and wringing them thoroughly. When they were slightly dry, we would put them on, hoping that the body heat would finally dry them before the rain came. The shore was filled with naked Marines washing their clothes in the ocean. Their bodies seemed impossibly white. The high humidity, rain, and lack of sun had killed all the colours. Against them, Kolo's shiny body was charcoal black. They looked at him with frank curiosity. When he brought me my clothes, I heard a mocking laugh, and then a delighted shriek from Creeper. Look at him. That's our rear rat. The bastard's got himself a valet. I'll write to his old man today to send his blue uniform here right away. When the boys, with Hohotun at their head, laughed and surrounded me, Kolo retreated. I didn't have time to make a dignified reply, for the sky darkened rapidly and the rain came down again. A cry of despair spread across the beach. We sat motionless for a few minutes, nowhere to hide, and then the big guy begged. Shoot me, he wailed. I can't live like this anymore. Somebody please show me mercy and put a bullet in my forehead. He glanced longingly at the ocean, rippled with raindrops, then at the leaden grey clouds in the sky, and finally at his still dry clothes. What the hell? He exclaimed. What else is there to wait for? And ran to the water. In the morning I lost my faithful soldier. The officers had taken Colorado away to serve in the officers' mess, which they had set up for themselves almost the very day we settled in the position. The officers' mess is the surest barometer of military success. As long as officers are crowded together with soldiers, there is a chance of defeat. But as soon as an officer's canteen appears, no matter what it looks like, it may be a tent, or a canopy strung on stakes, or even just an imaginary line whose crossing is taboo, it marks the restoration of caste, and thus victory is ours. That morning our 81mm mortars shelled an area to the east where Japanese artillery was thought to be located. Their guns were silenced forever. Our patrols made their way farther and farther in all directions. During one sortie to the east, Lieutenant Trotter, the same one who had put Hohotun, Chicken and me in the ship's brig, the Manora, killed a Japanese. To the south, Lieutenant Commando ran into an enemy firing point with a 20mm machine gun and killed 2. LT, Liberal, our new officer, killed 2 Japanese, also on a southern patrol. Following in the same direction, a patrol group of 50 Marines destroyed an enemy ambush of 3. This event occurred after the stupid Japs shouted in English, "Come here, please." Again, moving south toward Karsag, our patrol group passed the plateau where I had been firing on the Japs, and we had to hold our breath as we passed the stinking heap their bodies had turned into in a matter of days. A few days later, LT. Trotter met a patrol of the main force entrenched at Cape Gloucester and led us to our line. After climbing far south, LT. Commando was wounded by a Japanese sniper during an exchange of fire between his patrol and the enemy force, which included Japanese soldiers and natives armed with bows and arrows. He was too heavy and could not be carried back the dozen kilometers that separated the scene of the skirmish from our positions. A messenger was sent to the command post. When he arrived, I was just inside the tent. We set off to rescue Commando in an amphibious transporter. We were accompanied by schools of mackerel, and over the cliffs to our left were birds looking for carrion. On the way back, Commando was lying in the foredeck with his face twisted in pain. Commando may have had his brains all up his ass, but he never hid in battle. 4 days later, that is, January 11th, we left the police and followed the road stretching along the shore to Cape Gloucester. We walked past wrecked barges, through empty villages to a stretch of shore studded with smooth white stones, to the airfield, to the warmth and comfort of the division. I spent the night in a native hut, sheltered from the ubiquitous rain, and if not quite dry, at least not soaked through. When I woke up, I found that I could see almost nothing. Something had happened to my eyes. I felt as if my eyelids were stuck together. I got out into the light, and through the narrow slits left by my normal eyes I tried to see my comrades. They were just waking up and rising from the damp ground. Wrapped in long, soiled cloaks, they looked something like movie genies taking shape out of the pre-morning mist. I realized they were pointing their fingers in my direction and laughing. I groped my face. My lips were swollen and slightly upturned, like the women of Ubangi. My eyelids and nose too. Someone brought a mirror, from which an ugly gargoyle looked back at me. Half an hour later my face was back to the way it was, and I attributed it to a local bug bite and put it out of my mind. But now I think back and realize that this incident was another milestone in the war with the jungle. As a result of our mission to the coast, the Japanese were defeated. Although the most brutal battle, the 7th Regiment's capture of Hill 660, was still to come, our main enemy was now the jungle, not the Japanese. My swollen face came to symbolize the mysterious poisoning of this terrible island. By mentioning mystery, I wanted to emphasize that the island of New Britain was the embodiment of evil, dark, secret evil, the enemy of the human race. This enemy dissolved, decayed, poisoned people, sucked the life force out of them. The island came upon man with thick fog, green mold and incessant rains. It entangled man with roots, vines and vines, poisoned him with green insects, stinking bugs and tree bark. The jungle kept the sun out of people's faces and joy out of their hearts. Rain, slush, and mold penetrated every living cell, tearing it apart like little hands snipping petals from a flower. They were dissolving the man, turning him into an unintelligent, shapeless, amorphous substance, like water-swollen, softened earth into which it is so easy to fall when walking. Slop smack, that was the sound of nothingness, the monotonous song of the jungle, where everything disintegrates and dissolves at the command of the chief lord, the rain. Nothing could resist it. The letter from home had to be read, reread and memorized, because it would fall apart in less than a week. A pair of socks lasted the same amount of time, and a pack of cigarettes became damp and therefore useless if not smoked within a day. The blades of a pocket knife rusted and stuck together, and a watch measured its own decline. Rain turned food into disgusting garbage, pencils swelled and crumbled, fountain pens clogged and their quills broke. Rifle barrels were covered with a bluish mold, and had to be carried muzzle down to protect them from the pervasive rain. Bullets stuck together in the magazines, and the machine gunners had to do extra work every day to remove, lubricate and reinsert cartridges into the leptos to prevent the machine gun from malfunctioning at the most crucial moment. In short, everything, without exception, was either wet or drenched, disgustingly viscous to the touch, and spreading around the stinking fumes so characteristic of the jungle, that peculiar odor of decay which comes from vegetation so luxuriant and lush, growing so luxuriantly that its decay seems to begin at the moment of birth. A day or two after marching from Tawali to Sag, we entered the green hell. And here our battle with the rainforest began. People were involved in a conflict far more dangerous than our war with the Japanese. Here was a struggle for existence. The war was forgotten. Who could comprehend that? Who cared? There were only 24 hours in the day, and our brains were occupied with more important things: how, for example, to ensure at least relative dryness, to get some decent food, or oh, that would be wonderful, a hot cup of coffee. By the way, a pair of clean, dry pants would also be very useful. The hours dragged on endlessly, waiting for the moment when, before darkness fell, we could light a small fire using matches carefully wrapped in a condom, boil water, eat, smoke a cigarette, and prepare for the cold black night. After we had moved to our new positions, which were unremarkable except for the pretty little stream that ran past the battalion command post, I gradually began to get used to the horrible thought that I would be wet for exactly as long as we spent on New Britain. And it was not only the rain that was going to keep me wet after all. It stopped sometimes, and at times it was not too heavy, and the crowns of the age-old trees that formed a kind of roof in the jungle held it back. The fact was that I had a new aggravation of a disease which had begun because of the harsh conditions on Guadalcanal, had ceased during a period of civilized life in Australia, and had made itself felt again on a fairly good island, New Guinea and New Britain. I learned later that doctors call it enuresis. It manifests itself by the bladder emptying itself spontaneously when you sleep. Patrols resumed again. The Japanese had fled, and our patrols were busy destroying small groups of the enemy as they met in the jungle. Small, brief skirmishes became common. One patrol wiped out half a dozen Japanese, sometimes losing 1 or 2 men killed or wounded. Another suddenly attacked a large group of demoralized yellow-faced warriors, while a third encountered an ambush. A war of attrition was being waged. The enemy's life force was, in Big Guy's words, being grinded down. Days filled with anxiety because of constant patrolling were followed by anxious nights. What if under cover of darkness enemy spies sneaked into the camp? It cannot be said that the Japanese were very bloodthirsty and lived only by the thirst to kill. Rather, it was the complete disintegration of their troops that caused fear, as a result of which some of them might indeed try to sneak into our camp at night, bypassing the sentries, in search of stumps, and being discovered, they would certainly defend their lives desperately. It was the thought of the Japanese sneaking into our pack that kept me awake during the night patrols. One night there was a violent storm. I had just come off guard, crawled into my hammock and made myself comfortable. I had been lying half asleep for a long time, holding my knife in my relaxed hand, when suddenly I heard a shriek only 2 meters away from me. I turned to see what had happened, and in a flash of lightning I saw 2 dark figures pouncing on each other. The ensuing darkness hid the battlefield from me. Confusion reigned at the command post. Shouts and excited voices came from everywhere. I heard someone shouting in a very familiar voice. "The Japanese are at the CP. A Japanese just almost killed me." Came another voice, also belonging to one of our own. I climbed out of the hammock, clutched my knife in my left hand, reached for my machete with my right and yelled, "Over here. I see them." In the silence that reigned for a moment, the Major's bass sounded clearly. "Do not shoot. Work with bayonets." After that I heard a very distinct clang. The Major pulled the trigger. Of course, don't shoot, boys. Work with bayonets. You might hurt your Major." I went back to the concourse and listened to the frantic orders all around me, the howling of the wind and the noise of the rain, until I fell asleep. In the morning it turned out that 2 men from our unit who claimed to have engaged the Japanese had simply clashed with each other. They had disliked each other even before this unfortunate incident, and after it became a blood feud. In the end, we got out of the stinking swamp and moved to new positions. To do this, we had to drag ourselves for some time along a river of liquid and sticky mud, which used to be just a muddy road. On the way, we were joined by Eloquent, whom we had met when he had led Chicken and me from the brig. He was now moving with the rear echelon of the battalion to Cape Gloucester. He told how a certain first sergeant, while stationed on Goodenough Island, had shot himself. One night he went into a deep depression, put the muzzle of his Tommy in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Pretty messy ending, I'll give you that. In our opinion, if you want to end your life, you should choose something more decent. Now we were in reserve. We no longer had to defend our own section of the front. But we had a new enemy: trees. Our new positions were in a deep forest, which had been worked on by man, and the result was so gloomy and ominous that it evoked thoughts of horrible fairy tales or lunar landscapes, as they are portrayed in fantasy novels. The Japanese made a fierce resistance at this very spot, which was suppressed by a rampart of fire. Our shells had almost destroyed this forest, formerly composed of giant trees. Some of them lay fallen, shamelessly displaying the intricacy of their roots. Others were left standing, but had been stripped of their tops and were now headless, some of their branches and arms, and some of their entire crowns. Some were split as if by a lightning strike, many bent over, weakened by shell fragments, and so stood there, drenched in tears of rain. And day and night this grotesque, bizarre forest was silenced by the crackle of falling trees. At least 25 people were crushed to death beneath them. About the same number were wounded, and when we started blowing up dangerously leaning trees with dynamite, we quickly proved that bad treatment can be as harmful as the disease itself. A fellow was sitting quietly by his bunk when a huge limb fell on him and killed him dead. We all felt sorry for him, as he was the unwitting battalion clown. He was the fattest man who belonged to the Marine Corps. Moreover, strictly speaking, Krikun was not fat. He was of dense build, had a heavy chin and a round face covered with baby-smooth skin of a pinkish hue, which is usually characteristic of very obese people. A fat man doesn't stand a chance. Neither did Krikun, although he was a fairly intelligent man. He was constantly mocked, and when he tried to save himself from attack by assuming an arrogant, meaningful look, the teasing and jeering always turned his foolish vanity against himself. He liked to pretend that he was above all the platitudes and dangers of our daily life, and often repeated, "As for me, I'll be in Company B. I'll be here when you go away, and I'll be here when you don't come back. In the next war, boys, there will always be 2 men undercounted. Me and the military policeman who will be sent for me." So the bow cut short his life, and with it this man's cheerful boast. We pitied Krikun, an unattached, ridiculous man, and others have died under falling trees, which we nicknamed widow purveyors, but no one fell into despondency over it. In Krikun's case, however, it seemed unfair. Krikun never became a real military man, he was more of a spectator than a participant in the events. And he died a ridiculous death, as if a ball launched by a player's bat had blown his brains out of him. He was sitting quietly by his bunk, and a fallen bough took his life. The last patrol was a long one, it stretched over several days. We were taken by boat quite far from our positions to a place called Old Natamo, and there we were put ashore. Apparently there had been a lot of Japanese here, but now all their firing points and other defences were empty. The same Japanese that we found were in the heaviest condition. We found several of them crawling wherever they could see they could not walk, let alone run. There were gangrenous patients, their legs were blackened and rotting, dystrophics in extreme exhaustion, they weighed no more than 40 kilograms. They had no weapons, food or clothing, but they had a fighting spirit that deprivation could not break. It was the highest morale and essential feature of the Japanese Imperial Army that made the poorly trained and poorly armed soldier the most dangerous opponent. They all resisted, and all were destroyed, mostly stabbed with bayonets, as it is dangerous to fire while patrolling unknown territory. One of these poor fellows was strangled by one of our youngest soldiers, Deet. This young man, though he had had time on Guadalcanal, hardly knew what a razor was. 2 months later he went insane. That's how we cleared the area. During the night a real storm blew in, and we all hid under a shelter we had built on the shore. In the morning it was still raining, but the sea had a surprise for us. The downpour caused a small flood in the Forest of the Widows suppliers where our companions were staying, and the water carried all their provisions to the shore, where they were immediately swallowed by the sea. Apparently amused, the sea spit them back out right under our feet. We did not refuse these unexpected gifts from Neptune. Despite the fact that the food was ordinary egg powder, powdered milk, sugar, coffee, dried vegetables, we accepted this delightful gift with delight. After all, these products were not to be saved. Did we know that these were the lost supplies of our comrades? No, but if we had known, we would have enjoyed it even more. We ate pancakes and drank coffee all day. Still, the patrol was interrupted by bad weather. The next day, on a short patrol inland, I found a Japanese chest and, with Playboy's help, brought it in. It was strong and sturdy and therefore very suitable for my belongings and books, which my father now sent me regularly from the States. I already had about a dozen books, among them a dictionary and a yearbook, 2 works which had secured my reputation as the battalion sage. I and my clever books were called upon to settle disputes, which I did with a confidence as unwarranted as the vanity that resulted. While the fighting was going on, my books travelled with the rest of the company's property. When we were withdrawn from the front line, I claimed my property, and presently looked out for a convenient receptacle for it. The gunboats came up for us the next day, and we went aboard. Playboy and I carried the trunk. On our return we found the battalion hastily dismounting and bidding farewell to the gloomy forest without regret. We were transferred to camp, where tents were already pitched, promising a life of relative comfort. The latter attracted uninvited guests to us. One morning the artist reached for his cloak under his bunk and found a snake curled up in rings. He grabbed his carbine and shot the insolent creature. It was about 3 meters long and had a very beautiful head, but this beauty was sinister, deadly. A week after arriving at the new place, Lieutenant Big Kino showed up at our tent and requisitioned my trunk. He had taken it in my absence. I'd be more than happy to use the term stole, but I'd already said requisitioned, which is essentially the same theft, albeit official. Gritting my teeth, I headed for the big movie. The contest promised to be unequal, and in fact it couldn't be a contest at all. I could only make arguments and he could command, and in the end I would still lose my trunk, from which Big Kino had shaken my books and personal effects onto the bunk. But I couldn't deny myself the urge to look this thief in the eye. "The artist said you had my trunk," I began diplomatically. He glanced at me scornfully, but did not condescend to answer. "Did you just borrow it, sir?" "I borrowed it. It's needed at headquarters for packing company property." I followed his gaze and saw the open trunk. There were indeed some cartographic tools lying there, but most of it was occupied by Big Kino's clothes. A cold fury seized me. Ivy had stolen the cigars, Piece of Major had stolen the bacon from the battalion rations, the officers had stolen Colorado, and now Big Kino had stolen my trunk. "You know soldiers aren't allowed to have things like that in their tents," he said. What could I say? The rage that had taken possession of my whole being burst free. It craved violence, blood, death. By an inhuman effort of will, I managed to hold the demon inside me, though I didn't dare open my mouth for fear that it would break free. I could only stare at Lieutenant Big Kino in silence, certain that my face would speak for me. I could have killed him, but I walked away. The very next day, all the mapping tools were discarded and the chest moved into Big Kino's tent. It housed his personal belongings and still had room left over. The chest became my obsession. Anger and resentment boiled up inside me, demanding retribution. I began to talk about killing Big Kino, though I was careful to keep my mouth shut in the presence of his cronies, who would surely relay my words to him. Of course, it was all talk, idle chatter, but nevertheless it had the desired effect. A few days later, Big Kino sent an emissary to our tent. He made a wise choice, for his representative was the gambler, a fellow much beloved in the battalion. In poker he was unrivaled, and at the gaming table he knew no compromise, but in everything else he was a pleasant man and could smooth out sharp edges like no one else. "What are you guys doing here? What's all this silly talk about killing Big Movie?" He laughed merrily, making it clear that he took it as a funny joke. I smiled, too. "Who told you?" "Who told me?" "Don't be ridiculous. You might as well have written in big letters on your back, 'I'll get Big Movie.'" Then his tone changed. He spoke seriously. "Look, kid, you shouldn't talk like that. Somebody's going to take what you say seriously, and you're going to get a lot of trouble on your ass. And Big Movie's going crazy." "I hope he does take me seriously. He's probably shaking his tail, motherfucker." "What do you got against him?" "He stole my trunk." "What do you mean he stole it? Where did you get it from?" "I know what you're saying," I said angrily, "but only the Japanese had the right to come and get it at any time, and Big Kino stole it, and there's no point in choosing more literary expressions. The essence won't change anyway. He said that he was taking it for the company's property, and he himself put his clothes there. Even after being warned that the Big Movie might take action, I stayed my course, or in other words, stubborn as a donkey. When my shift came, I went for a swim in the waterfall with Playboy and Eloquent. The waterfall was in the upper reaches of a narrow rivulet that flowed past our tents. The water fell from a height of over 4 meters into a deep, foaming pool. 1.5 meters higher, there was a small hollow in the rock. There you could climb up and stab into the waterfall. The moment you hit the rushing stream, it picks you up, forcing you to fall like a stone into the cold backwater, down into the darkness, into the unknown. When the lack of air becomes palpable, fear grips you, your legs seem to spontaneously start working, pushing off the water and breaking your fall. And then you rush upward, where there is plenty of good clean air, filled with the rumble of falling water and the enthusiastic cries of friends. But that day it was my first experience. I felt a sudden pain in my lower abdomen. Perhaps it was a small hernia or an indication of its impending arrival, I don't know. I had experienced something similar on Guadalcanal when I was carrying heavy boxes of shells. But there was no treatment, so I ignored the pain. Now it was happening again, and I felt uneasy. It was hard for me to walk. The feeling, to put it bluntly, was not a pleasant one. Playboy helped me to the tent. I was reluctant to go to the hospital as I hoped the pain would go away. But as I entered the tent, I changed my mind. "Big movie wants to see you," said the waiting artiste. "They're sending you to the galley." "What's wrong?" "I think I have a hernia." "So what are you happy about?" "That I'm not going to the galley, of course. I can't wait to break the good news to Big Movie." I waddled down to the infirmary. The doctor looked me over and started writing something on a blue piece of paper. "What is it, sir?" I inquired. "An evacuation order." "There's nothing we can do for you here. I'm evacuating you to New Guinea. You're to be here with your things in the morning." What joy a piece of blue paper can bring. I can't wait to fight like this much longer. I must have looked at that moment like a prisoner awaiting cruel punishment and suddenly being pardoned. So I headed for the Big Movie tent in a very high spirits. "You wanted to see me, sir?" I asked respectfully. At that moment I was respect personified. "Yes." His face was stern and his voice unyielding. "You are to report to the galley." "But, sir," I continued respectfully, "I thought intelligence personnel were exempt from galley duty. That's what you promised me when you suggested I join you." He didn't look me in the eye, but he sounded like he wanted revenge at any cost. "Not anymore. From now on, we'll have to send a man to the galley. You will work there for the month of March." "Yes, sir, but only during March will someone else be there." What he finally looked me straight in the eye, his face twisted with anger. "I can't carry out your orders, sir. I'm being sent to the hospital." He was so frankly disappointed that it couldn't help but please me. I felt avenged and triumphant, waited for him to get tired of glaring at me so I could leave. "What the hell? What do you mean you're going to the hospital? Says who? I'm still your commanding officer." "The doctor at the infirmary said I have a hernia," I said, wisely withholding information about evacuating to New Guinea. "Why take any unnecessary risks? I'll tell the battalion master sergeant tomorrow morning. Might even have to do the operation I added to strengthen my position." Now Lieutenant Big Kino looked at me with undisguised hatred, even a little strange for a man accustomed to command. "All right," he gritted his teeth. "I'll take care of you when you get back. You may think you've beaten me, but you're dead wrong. You'll still be working in the galley like a sweetheart." "Yes, sir," I said. "Permission to go?" The big transport plane roared down the runway at Cape Gloucester and took off. I made myself comfortable in my assigned seat. Leveling off, the plane flew over the Dampier Strait and headed for New Guinea. It turned out that the jungle from above looked like a dense Brussels sprouts. The airplane landed at Cape Sudest. There an ambulance painted in khaki color was waiting for us. We were now in the hands of the army. We were on our way to one of the army stationary hospitals. It was housed in a prefabricated corrugated iron house. A nurse, the first woman I had seen in 6 months, issued me pajamas and escorted me to my bunk. 2 or 3 days flew by and seemed like an idyll, lying down, reading, getting hot meals 3 times a day, going to the movies in the evening. Then came the day of examination. The doctors decided that such an operation should not be done in the tropics, but for some reason they did not decide to send me to Australia or even to the States. I can't tell you how disappointed I was. Would I have to return to Cape Gloucester to the vengeful Big Kino, saying goodbye to the beautiful library I had discovered in the hospital? But during the night the situation changed again. I was struck down by a violent attack of malaria. Not even in my worst nightmares had I foreseen such a terrible deliverance. I was far away from the galley and the vengeful lieutenant, but my whole body was burning with fire, and I would have preferred to spend a year in the galley and have a dozen commanders like Big Kino, but only to get out of the hellfire I was in. No, of course I wasn't aiming for any of that. I just wanted to be released from the raging fever that shook my body relentlessly. And if death was the only deliverance, well, so be it. Lying on my back was torture. Lying on my stomach was agony. I lay on my side, but even in that position my whole body ached as if caught in a giant vise. I couldn't eat, I couldn't even drink water. I was given food intravenously, I don't know how long, it must have been 10 days or 2 weeks. And all the time I lay there roasting, baking, not smouldering, not burning, but baking, as if I were in a huge oven, feeling the desire to live inside me shriveling up, shriveling up. I had no desires, the only thing I wanted was for a tiny drop of sweat to break out of my shriveled flesh. I could hear that there were living people around me, walking, talking, and even laughing. I felt an instant chill when absorbent cotton soaked in alcohol touched my hand, a blessed reminder of the world I had left. I perceived nothing, lying on my bunk a heap of aching flesh and bone, shrinking into a malarial furnace. And then the fever broke, and sweat poured from all my pores like a healing balm. It brought a divine coolness to my body, and I could laugh, sing, shout if I had the strength. I felt ungrateful, lying on the bunk, washed by the cool liquid flowing from my body, and showing no sign of gratitude. But I was too weak to move. So an atheist has no God in his soul to thank for the favour shown. And besides, I had so removed myself from my own religion that I felt no impulse to pour out gratitude in my soul. The sweat drenched the bed, and the nurse, glad to see that I was on the mend, transferred me to another bed, which I also drenched. And then the chills started. I was shivering, and they piled a whole pile of blankets on me. The temperature was over 40 degrees, but they covered me as if it were 4 times lower, and I was still freezing. But after what I had been through, I didn't care about anything. I even began to laugh and often repeated with trembling lips, "I feel good, Lord. I feel so good." Eventually this passed, but it took several days before I could sit down and eat. The smell of food made me nauseous, and at first I ate only tea and slices of dried bread. It took quite a long time before I was eating with the other patients, and as I recall, it was with great difficulty that I brought the first spoonful of food to my mouth. After another week I left the hospital, back to the evacuation point on the shore, and from there to Cape Gloucester, and we crossed the Dampier Strait at night on a converted fishing schooner. And as luck would have it, a great storm broke out. Black water was rising over the sides of the ship and falling on the deck, where we were sleeping peacefully. We had to escape to our cabin, where we spent the night, suffering from seasickness. I will not say that fate smiled on me on my return to Cape Gloucester, but at least it was not overly cruel. It turned out that most of my battalion was on patrol somewhere in a remote part of the island, and LT. Big Kino was among them. The master sergeant, seeing that I was very weak, showed mercy and assigned me to an easy job, the senior NCO mess hall. So my flight to New Guinea turned out to be essentially useless. The hernia stayed with me, and I got only a short reprieve thanks to a malaria attack. When I returned to the unit, I was immediately assigned to the galley, thus proving that a private who relies on his own strength is just a self-righteous idiot. Actually, there was nothing too unpleasant about this assignment. It was just a matter of keeping the tent clean, brushing crumbs off the wooden tables, and setting tables for the handful of men who were free from patrolling. Their food was delivered to them from the main galley in tin containers. A few days later the battalion returned, and I was happy to hear that Big Kino had been transferred and our new commander was Liberal, a rather young second lieutenant who had distinguished himself by killing a Japanese on his first patrol. The next few weeks were eventful. To pass the time, we started playing bridge. We played passionately, interrupted only by sleeping and eating or getting our allowance. We became avid players and remained so until the climax, when the player, annoyed by his partner's ineptitude, jumped up, tore up the only deck of cards in his heart and scattered the candles. We weren't too upset, as we all knew that we would have to relocate the next day. The gambler knew it too, which is why he allowed himself a little extra. an army unit arrived to replace us. We watched mockingly as the stoves and suitcases were unloaded ashore first, followed by everything else. Then we boarded the landing craft, the now familiar Trojan horse, and left the cursed island for good. As the song goes, we didn't know where we were going, but we were going.